Hello and welcome back. So in the last lecture, we created an entity metadata as well as an entity config using NgRx Data. So if I go to our application, here you can see in the last lecture, when we installed NgRx Data for our Angular application, it created this entity metadata.ts file. And in this entity metadata.ts file, we have this constant called entity metadata, which we are assigning to this entity metadata. And this entity metadata is a configuration for our entity which we are creating using this entity data module config. So this configuration we are assigning to entity config, and we are registering this entity config in our app module using entity data module. So basically this entity config, it stores all our entities which we are going to use in our application, as well as we can also add some other configurations for all the entities. Now, if I save the changes here and if you go to our application, there you will see that we do not have any error in the console. But one thing which I want to show here is the NgRx data makes use of HTTP client in order to make HTTP request. So if I go to app-module.ts and from there, if I remove this HTTP client module for now, and if I save the changes, and if we go back, you will notice that here we have an error and it says Null Injector Error, no provider for HTTP client. Basically what is happening is, since we are using NgRx data in our Angular application now, it is automatically trying to make an HTTP call in order to fetch all the data from the backend related to the entities which we have defined here. Okay, and to make those HTTP calls, it needs HTTP client module. But since we have removed it, it is not able to make that HTTP call. So we also need to add this HTTP client module in our root module where we have registered our NgRx data module, this entity data module. So this I wanted to show you because since I'm not creating this application from scratch, I would have missed this and you might have got some error. So just wanted to make sure that you don't get this error which we just saw. And with this, if I save the changes and if we go back, we will not have any error. Now let's go back to our application. Let me close this app-module.ts file for now. Now, in order to work with the entities which we have defined here, in order to perform CRUD operation on these entities, we need to create an entity service. Okay, so currently I'm going to create an entity service for this course entity because this is the one which we are going to work with. So for that, I will go to course folder, and in this courses folder, I already have a service folder where I have defined this course service.ts file. Now, in this lecture, I'm not going to use this course service.ts file. I have kept it here because we have written some logic in order to perform CRUD operation on the courses data, which we are saving in Firebase database. So I will copy some of the logics from here. Okay, so for that, I have kept this file. Later, I will delete this file. But here, let me go ahead and let me create a new file in this services folder. And I'm going to call this file as course-entity.service.ts. Okay, and inside this again we are going to create and export a class. I'm going to call this class as course entity service. You can name this anything. You can also call it as course service. But since I already have a class called course service, that's why I'm calling it as course entity service. So you can also call it as course entity service. There is no problem in that. And let's decorate it with @injectable decorator. And to use this @injectable decorator, we also need to import it. And let's also provide it from root. Okay, this service we might need in other components, in other modules. So that's why I'm going to provide it from root. If you're going to use this service only in the courses module, then you can also provide it from that module. Now here, we are going to make this class inherit from an existing class. So for that, I'm going to use this implements keyword. And which class we are going to implement? Here, we are going to implement entity collection service base. Okay, this is the class which we are going to implement for this course entity service. And this class is basically going to provide us some methods which we are going to use in order to perform CRUD operations. So for example, let's go to the documentation, and there let me go to the architecture, and here we have entity collection service. If I go there and if I scroll down, you will see that it provides us methods like add to add a new entity object, delete to delete an entity object, update to update an entity object, etc. Okay, so in order to use these methods, which is provided by the entity collection service, we need to make our course entity service class implement from that class. And when we are implementing this class, there are few things which we need to do. And actually here it should be extends, because here we are going to inherit from a class and we are not going to implement an interface. So it should be extends. Okay. And when we are extending this from within this course entity service, we are going to create the constructor. Okay. And from within that constructor, we are going to call the constructor of this class. So here I'm going to specify super keyword. So using this super keyword, we are going to call the constructor of the parent class. To this, we need to pass two things. First, we need to pass the name of our entity. The name of our entity is course. So I'm going to pass course here. Okay. And second, we need to pass an instance of entity collection service elements factory. So for that, we are going to ask Angular to inject an instance of entity collection service element factory. You can name it anything. I just want to keep a short name. So that's why I'm calling it as ECSEF, entity collection service elements factory. And this is going to be of type entity collection service element factory. Okay. And this we need to pass as the second argument to the parent constructor. And here also, when we have extended this class, here we also need to specify the entity type. So this service class, this entity service, we are going to use for our courses entity. So we have created that course entity here, and we are passing it as the first argument to its constructor. And here we need to specify the type for this entity. So far we have not specified what will be the type for this entity, but here we can specify that type. So this entity is going to be of type course, and this course we are going to import from course model file. Okay, so here we are telling that our course entity is going to be of type course, and we are going to use this service, basically this service class, in order to perform CRUD operation on our course entity. And with this, if I save the changes and if I go to our course component where we want to show all the courses, so here I have CourseComponent.ts file. In there, first of all, I need to inject an instance of this course entity service. So here I'm going to create a private variable. I'll call it as course entity service. Okay, and this is going to be of type course entity service. So we are also going to import it. And now inside this ng on init, what I'm going to do is here I will say this dot course entity service dot, and now you will see that here we have methods. These methods are provided by this parent class in order to perform CRUD operation. So here if I say dot, you will see all the methods. So we have the add method to add a new entity object. We have this delete method to delete an entity object. We have, if I scroll down, we have this getAll method to get all the entities, and we should have update as well. If I scroll down, we have this update method to update an entity, right? So here I'm going to use getAll because I want to fetch all the course entities. So I can call getAll method. If I hover over this getAll method, what it is going to return us? It is going to return us an observable of courses, right? Because here we have specified that we are going to extend this service for course type, basically for course entity. And with this, if I save the changes, and what I'll also do is I'll assign this courses. So here I will say this dot courses, this course is observable, and to that we are going to assign whatever value will be returned by this observable. Remember that this getAll method is going to return us an observable, and this observable is going to emit all the courses. It is going to emit a course list. With this, if I save the changes and if we go to our application, you will not see any courses rendered here, but here we have some error. And if you see, the error which we have is it is trying to make a get call to this URL. Notice this URL. So here I can show you that. Let me move it to the bottom so that it will be visible. So if I go to request URL, this part which you see here, this is the access token which we are adding with the request. If you remember, we have added this auth query parameter, and to that we assigned our access token. So just ignore this part for now and just notice this URL, http localhost 4200. So this is the URL on which our application is running. This is the domain, you can say. And after that, we have this slash API slash courses. So basically what this method is doing is, this getAll method, it is assuming that our API is running on the same domain where our Angular application is running. And there the API endpoint is root URL slash API slash the name of the entity. And if you see, the entity name has been made plural. An S has been added after the entity name. And we have specified our entity in uppercase. So here C is uppercase. So first of all, in the URL, this C has been converted to lowercase and it has been made plural by adding S to it. So that's what you will see here. The URL to which it is trying to make a GET request is our root URL where our Angular application is running slash API slash courses. So the entity has been made plural, and from there it is trying to fetch a list of courses. So if your API is running on the same domain where your Angular application is running, and there for the endpoint you have slash API slash the entity name, then it will fetch the data from there and it will display it in the UI. You don't need to do anything else. But in our case, our API is not running on this URL, right? Instead, we are making use of Firebase, and Firebase is providing us an API URL, which if I show you, if I go to env file which we have created, so somewhere I should have the env file, yeah, environments file. There you will see that for us, this is the API endpoint. Basically, this is the database URL, and in order to fetch data from this database, this is our endpoint. And since we want to fetch the courses data after this endpoint, we need to specify slash courses.json, and it will return us all the courses. So we need to fetch data from this URL. If I copy this and if I go to the browser, and there if I paste this URL, and after that if I say slash course.json, or it is courses.json, if I press enter, okay, it says permission denied because here I'm not attaching the JSON web token, right? If I go ahead and if I copy that JSON web token as well, like this, and if I add it here, and now if I make the request, now you'll see it is returning us all the course data. If I say pretty print, you can see it here. So we need to make API call to this URL, basically to this URL, in order to fetch course details. But by default, what NgRx Data is doing is it is making an API call to this URL. So this is the default behavior. So now what we need to do is we need to change this default behavior. And how can we change this default behavior? That we will see in our next lecture. So in this lecture, we created our course entity service, and using this course entity service, we can use the methods provided by this entity collection service space in order to perform CRUD operation. But here it is going to use the default API URL in order to perform CRUD operation, and we don't want that. So we need to modify the default behavior. That we will do in our next lecture. This is all from this lecture. If you have any questions from this lecture, then feel free to ask it. Thank you for listening and have a great day.